The half-blind slave woman no one wanted, until she noticed the fire by the heat. The auction block in Charleston stood beneath a grey November sky, the kind that pressed down on the harbour like a wet blanket, suffocating hope before it could take flight. Sarah stood with her head slightly tilted, her right eye clouded white as milk, the left one barely better, seeing the world through a permanent fog. At 43, she was considered old for the trade, her hands gnarled from years of laundry work, her back bent from decades of carrying burdens not her own. The auctioneer's voice droned through descriptions of younger, stronger prospects, while Sarah remained unsold, a relic no one wanted. Until Thomas Blackwood raised his paddle, the crowd murmured in confusion. Blackwood owned Riverside Plantation, 300 acres of tobacco fields, an hour north of Charleston, and he was known for two things: his ruthless efficiency and his peculiar experiments. No one understood why he would buy a half-blind woman who could barely see her own hands, but Blackwood's money was as good as anyone's. Sarah felt the rope tighten around her wrists as she was led to his wagon, her damaged eyes unable to see his face clearly, but her other senses already screaming warnings she had learned long ago to silence. The journey to Riverside took 3 hours on rutted roads that made Sarah's bones ache. She sat in the back of the wagon, listening to the driver's whip crack against the horses, memorizing sounds and smells instead of sights, pine trees and swamp water, tobacco fields and wood smoke, and something else, something chemical and wrong that she couldn't quite place. When they finally arrived, Sarah was taken not to the slave quarters behind the main house, but to a small building near the tobacco barns. The overseer, a thin man named Carver, with breath that smelled of whiskey and decay, pushed her inside without a word. The room was bare, except for a straw mattress and a bucket. A single window, barred and shuttered, let in thin strips of light. Sarah ran her hands along the walls, feeling scratch marks in the wood, old and deep. Someone had been here before her, many someones, all trying to claw their way out. Her fingers found words carved into the timber: help us and basement and fire. The letters were rough, desperate, made by fingernails and improvised tools. Sarah traced each one, committing them to memory through touch, since her eyes could barely make out shadows. That first night she heard the screaming. It came from somewhere below her, muffled but unmistakable, a sound of such pure terror that Sarah's blood turned to ice. She pressed her ear to the floorboards and heard other things too. Mechanical sounds, grinding and pumping, and voices speaking in calm, measured tones that somehow made the screams worse. When morning came, the sounds stopped, and Carver brought her a bowl of thin gruel and a warning. "Mr. Blackwood don't like questions. You do your work, keep your mouth shut, and maybe you'll last longer than the others." Sarah's work, it turned out, was simple. Each morning, she was led to the laundry house where she would wash linens from the main house. But the linens were strange, covered in stains that no amount of lye and scrubbing could fully remove. Dark stains that smelled of chemicals and something organic and terrible. Sometimes there were clothes too, fine gentlemen's clothes, but sized for people much smaller, children's clothes. Sarah washed them all, her damaged eyes unable to see the full horror, but her sense of smell and touch telling her everything she needed to know. In the evenings, she was locked back in her room, and that's when she began to truly pay attention. Sarah had learned long ago that blindness was not a disability, but a different way of seeing. She felt the vibrations in the floorboards when people walked below. She smelled the chemical odor growing stronger at certain times, usually deep in the night. She heard the pattern of screams, always starting around midnight, always stopping before dawn. And she noticed that some of the other enslaved people who worked in the fields would disappear, and new ones would arrive, a constant rotation that no one spoke about but everyone knew. 3 weeks into her time at Riverside, Sarah met Clara in the laundry house. Clara was 16, recently purchased from a plantation in Virginia, and unlike Sarah, her eyes worked perfectly. But Clara had noticed things too, and in whispered conversations over steaming washtubs, they began to piece together the truth. The tobacco barn that no one was allowed to enter. The doctor from Charleston who visited every full moon. The wagon that left in the middle of the night covered with canvas, heading toward the swamps, and most damning of all, the ledger that Clara had glimpsed when cleaning Blackwood's study, filled with names and numbers, and the word specimens, repeated again and again. "He's selling them," Clara whispered, her voice breaking, "not as slaves, but as something else. To doctors up north who need bodies for their medical schools, but he ain't waiting for them to die natural. He's—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. They were in the presence of evil so profound it made slavery, already an abomination, seem like only the first circle of hell. That night, Sarah lay awake and felt the heat before she smelled the smoke. It was her gift, the compensation for her ruined eyes. She could sense temperature changes with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural, but was merely the result of heightened senses. The air in her room was growing warmer, not from any visible fire, but from somewhere below. She pressed her face to the floor and felt the heat radiating through the wood. Something was burning in the basement, and it was spreading. Sarah pounded on her door, screaming for help, but Carver was drunk in his quarters, and the night guards were making their rounds on the far side of the property. She could feel the heat intensifying, could smell the smoke beginning to seep through the floorboards. In moments of crisis, the body does impossible things, and Sarah's hands found the small gap between the door and frame. She'd been working the gap for weeks, with a nail she'd found, weakening the wood grain by grain. Now, with flames beginning to lick at the floor below her, she threw her weight against the door and felt it splinter. She tumbled into the night air, her lungs burning from the smoke she'd inhaled, her skin hot from the proximity to flames. But instead of running toward the slave quarters or the main house, Sarah ran toward the tobacco barn. If she was going to die this night, she would die knowing the truth. The barn doors were locked, but the old wood was dry, and Sarah found a stone and smashed the lock until it broke. Inside, the smell hit her first. Chemicals and death and something medicinal that made her stomach heave. Her eyes, poor as they were, could see the shapes. Tables with leather straps, instruments that glinted in the moonlight coming through the gaps in the walls, jars filled with things floating in liquid. And in the corner, a door leading down to the basement. The fire was spreading from below, but Sarah descended anyway, one hand on the wall, feeling her way down stone steps slick with moisture and other things she didn't want to identify. The heat was intense, but not yet unbearable, and at the bottom, she found the source of all those screams. The basement was a laboratory of horrors. Bodies in various stages of dissection lay on tables, journals filled with notes about experiments, how long a person could survive without food, what happened when certain organs were removed, the effects of different poisons, and in the corner, a furnace where Blackwood disposed of the evidence, except tonight someone had overfed it, and the fire had spread to the wooden support beams. The whole plantation was about to become an inferno. Sarah grabbed one of the journals and ran back up the stairs, her lungs screaming for clean air. Outside, people were finally noticing the fire. Enslaved workers were running from their quarters, and Sarah could hear Blackwood's voice shouting orders to form a bucket brigade. But the fire had too much of a head start, and the tobacco barn exploded in flames that reached toward the night sky like accusing fingers. In the chaos, Sarah found Clara and pressed the journal into her hands. "Run," Sarah said. "North. Find someone who'll listen. Make them see what happened here." Clara hesitated, torn between survival and solidarity, but Sarah pushed her toward the tree line. I'm too old and too blind to make it far, but you can. You have to tell them, all of them, the ones who disappeared, the ones he sold, the experiments. Make them understand what freedom really means. Not just the absence of chains, but the right to live without being turned into specimens for rich men's curiosity. Clara ran, and Sarah watched her go with her ruined eyes that couldn't see details but could see the shape of hope disappearing into the darkness. Then Sarah turned back toward the plantation. The main house was catching now. Flames racing up the white columns that stood as monuments to prosperity built on suffering. Enslaved people were fleeing in every direction, taking advantage of the confusion, and Sarah was glad. Let them all run. Let them find whatever freedom existed in a country that wrote pretty words about liberty while building its wealth on the bodies of the enslaved. Blackwood stood in front of his burning house, screaming at his servants to save his belongings, his ledgers, his scientific instruments. He didn't see Sarah approach, didn't notice the half-blind woman he'd bought as a curiosity and a subject for future experiments. When he finally turned and saw her standing there with smoke billowing behind her, he laughed, a sound of madness and rage. "You did this," he said. "You started the fire." "No," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the inferno around them. "You started the fire. Maybe not tonight, but every day you turned people into things. Every time you decided your curiosity was worth more than someone's life. I just noticed it before it burned us all." She held up the stained linens she'd been washing for weeks. "I may not see much, but I see enough, and now others will too." Blackwood lunged at her, but Sarah had spent 43 years learning to survive, and she sidestepped his clumsy attack. He stumbled toward the burning tobacco barn, trying to save his precious journals, his evidence, his legacy. The roof collapsed as he entered, and Thomas Blackwood was never seen again. The official report would say he died trying to save his property from a fire of unknown origin. The truth would take longer to surface, but it would surface, carried by a 16-year-old girl who ran north with a journal full of horrors. Sarah didn't try to run. She sat on the ground, far enough from the flames to be safe, close enough to feel their heat, and watched Riverside Plantation burn. Other enslaved people gathered around her, some crying, some silent, all understanding that they were witnessing something more than a fire. They were witnessing the destruction of one man's evil, small in the scope of a nation's sins, but significant nonetheless. When the overseer Carver tried to round them up, to reassert control even as his world burned, it was the field hands who stopped him. Their numbers and desperation overwhelming his whip and his authority. By dawn, Riverside was ash and ember. The neighboring plantation owners arrived to help, but there was nothing to save. They found Sarah sitting in the same spot, her cloudy eyes reflecting the dying flames. They questioned her, but she gave them nothing, claiming her blindness had prevented her from seeing what started the fire. The ledgers were gone, burned in Blackwood's house. The laboratory was destroyed, its secrets turned to smoke. Only the journal Clara carried contained the truth, and she was already 2 counties away, moving under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness that promised either freedom or capture. The enslaved people of Riverside were dispersed to other plantations, sold to settle Blackwood's debts, scattered like seeds to the wind. But they carried stories with them, whispered accounts of disappearances and experiments, of a man who treated humans as laboratory animals, of a half-blind woman who noticed a fire by its heat and gave them all a chance to escape. The stories spread through the secret networks that connected enslaved people across the South, becoming legend and warning and hope all at once. Sarah was sold again, this time to a plantation owner in Georgia who needed laundry workers and didn't ask too many questions about past employment. She washed clothes and kept her head down and listened to the world through her other senses. Sometimes she heard news from travelers. A journal had reached abolitionist circles in Boston, exposing the horrors of Riverside and other plantations where enslaved people had disappeared without explanation. Medical schools were being investigated. Laws were being proposed, though Sarah knew laws meant little in a nation that could legalize slavery while proclaiming all men created equal. Sarah learned years later, had made it to Canada. She had testified before abolitionist societies, her words carrying the weight of truth that no amount of Southern propaganda could deny. The journal had been published in fragments, its contents too graphic for full disclosure, but powerful enough to strengthen the arguments of those who opposed slavery. Lives had been saved, though countless more remained in bondage. Small victories in an enormous struggle, but victories nonetheless. On cold nights, when her bones ached and her damaged eyes wept from strain, Sarah would remember that night at Riverside. She would remember the heat rising through the floorboards, the smell of smoke that preceded visible flames, the moment when her disability became her greatest strength. She had noticed the fire by the heat, not the light, and in doing so had revealed a different kind of fire. The burning truth that slavery was not just economic exploitation, but a system that could reduce humans to specimens, experiments, property to be used and disposed of at will. Freedom, Sarah understood, was not just the absence of legal bondage. It was the right to be seen as human, to have one's life matter beyond its utility to others. The enslaved people who disappeared at Riverside had died because they were invisible, their absence noted only in Blackwood's ledgers as lost property or failed experiments. But Clara had made them visible again, had forced the world to see what happened when people were treated as things. That was true freedom, the right to be seen, to be counted, to have one's suffering acknowledged and one's life mourned. Years passed, and the nation moved toward a civil war that would reshape everything. Sarah did not live to see slavery's end. She died in 1859, still enslaved, still washing clothes for masters who owned her body, but never her spirit. Her death was not recorded in any newspaper. Her name appeared in no historical accounts, her burial site unmarked and forgotten. But her story lived on in the whispered tales of enslaved communities, in the testimony Clara gave to anyone who would listen, in the journal that circulated through abolitionist circles like a forbidden gospel. The fire at Riverside Plantation was never forgotten, though its cause remained officially mysterious. Some said it was divine judgment. Others claimed it was the work of abolitionists or rival plantation owners. A few whispered the truth, that a half-blind woman had noticed things others missed and had given an entire community a chance at escape. The neighboring plantations installed better locks and stricter patrols, but they could not lock away the knowledge that their system was built on brutality so profound it could transform a doctor into a murderer and a plantation into a death camp. In the decades after the war, when historians began documenting the horrors of slavery, they found scattered references to medical experiments conducted on enslaved people, bodies sold to medical schools, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, deliberate infections to study disease progression. Riverside was mentioned occasionally, always in footnotes, always with incomplete information. But those who dug deeper, who read Clara's testimony and examined the surviving fragments of Blackwood's journal, understood that Riverside was not an aberration, but an extreme manifestation of slavery's logic. If people could be property, they could also be specimens, test subjects, disposable material in the pursuit of knowledge and profit. The half-blind woman who noticed the fire by the heat became, in these histories, a symbol of resistance through perception. She represented all those who saw truths that the sighted chose to ignore, who understood that the heat of oppression preceded its visible flames, who knew that the real fire was not in the burning buildings, but in the burning rage against a system that denied humanity to millions. Sarah had noticed the fire, but she had also understood what it meant. that destruction was sometimes necessary for revelation, that some evils could only be exposed through their own catastrophic unraveling. Modern scholars debate the details of the Riverside fire. Some question whether one woman could have made such a difference. Others argue that the fire was likely accidental, that attributing it to intentional action gives too much weight to individual agency in a system designed to crush individuality. But those who understand the nature of resistance know that small actions matter, that noticing matters, that surviving with one's humanity intact is itself a form of victory. Sarah had washed the stains from Blackwood's linens and understood what they meant. She had felt the heat rising and known danger approached. She had opened a door and revealed a horror, and in doing so had given others the chance to escape or fight or simply survive another day. The message of Sarah's story transcends its historical moment. It speaks to the nature of freedom in any era, that freedom requires seeing clearly even when vision is impaired. It requires noticing the heat before the flames become visible, recognizing danger in subtle signs that others dismiss. It requires understanding that oppression operates through making people invisible, turning them into numbers and categories and property, and that resistance means forcing the world to see individuals again, to acknowledge their pain and their humanity and their right to exist beyond their utility to those in power. Sarah's clouded eyes saw more clearly than Blackwood's perfect vision because she understood what mattered. She did not need to see fine details to know right from wrong, to feel heat rising, to understand that some fires are necessary even when they destroy everything. Her blindness was not a weakness, but a different way of perceiving, one that made her sensitive to truths others missed. And in the end, it was this sensitivity, this alternative way of seeing, that exposed Riverside's horrors and gave dozens of people a chance at freedom. The fire at Riverside Plantation burned for 3 days, consuming everything. The main house with its fine furniture and imported rugs, the tobacco barns with their harvest and tools, the quarters where enslaved people had slept on dirt floors, the laboratory with its instruments of torture disguised as medical research. When the ashes cooled, nothing remained but stone chimneys, and the truth that some evils are so profound they leave marks that outlast any physical structure. The ground where Riverside once stood never grew crops again. Locals said the land was cursed, but the real curse was the memory of what had happened there, the knowledge that such places existed throughout the South, hidden behind fine architecture and polite society. Sarah's legacy is the legacy of all those who resist oppression by refusing to be blind to it, who notice the heat before the fire consumes everything, who understand that freedom is not given but taken, moment by moment, choice by choice. She did not live to see slavery end, did not benefit from the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment, but her actions on that November night in 1855 mattered. They saved lives. They exposed evil. They proved that even the most powerless person can change everything if they pay attention, if they notice what others miss, if they act when action seems impossible. The half-blind slave woman no one wanted became, in the end, the person everyone needed, someone who could see through the pretty lies and comfortable fictions to the burning truth beneath. Thomas Blackwood had bought her thinking she was worthless, a curiosity at best, a future specimen at worst. He never understood that her damaged eyes had learned to see things his perfect vision would always miss. He never realized that the heat she felt rising through the floorboards was not just from the fire in his basement, but from the rage of people who had been turned into things and were finally, desperately, reaching for their humanity again. And so the fire burned, and the truth spread, and Sarah sat in the ashes of Riverside Plantation, watching the sun rise over a world that was still unjust, but slightly less hidden in its cruelty. She had noticed the fire by the heat, and in doing so had illuminated a darkness that many preferred to ignore. That was her gift and her curse, to see clearly what others denied, to feel the heat of oppression before it consumed everything, to understand that freedom was not a destination, but a constant struggle against those who would reduce humans to property, to specimens, to things that could be used and discarded without consequence. The story ends where it began, with Sarah on an auction block, except this time it is not in Charleston but in memory, in the whispered tales of resistance that enslaved people shared in secret, in the historical records that partially document her existence. She stands there still, head tilted, eyes clouded, hands gnarled from labor, a woman no one wanted who became essential when she noticed what others missed. The fire by the heat, the truth in the stains, the horror in the basement, the freedom in resistance, these are her legacy, and they burn still, warming those who have learned to notice the heat before the flames become visible, who understand that oppression must be seen clearly before it can be fought, who know that even damaged eyes can perceive truths that perfect vision misses. In the end, Sarah's story is about perception and power, about who gets to see and who is forced to remain invisible, about the fires that burn beneath the surface of societies built on exploitation. It is a story about noticing the heat, noticing the stains, noticing the disappearances, noticing the patterns that reveal systematic evil. And it is a story about freedom, not the abstract freedom of political rhetoric, but the concrete freedom of choosing to see clearly, to act decisively, to resist oppression even when resistance seems futile. Sarah was half blind, but she saw what mattered, and that made all the difference.